Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Alada Taylor, and it's a pleasure to be here with you to co-lead our Clearinghouse on Women's Issues discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on women in the workforce and their work life. I am joined by my colleagues, Ms. Jeanette Esbrook, attorney, and Ms. Sherry Klein. One of the major concerns since the beginning of the pandemic was the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women and girls. While we know women's rights have seen some gains after decades of struggle, a major threat to the gains women have made has been in the workplace as a result of COVID-19. According to the 2023 Brookings Institute Gender Quality Series, millions of women were already struggling and supporting their families on meager wages before COVID. But then the lockdown sent unemployment rates skyrocketing and millions of jobs disappeared. Working mothers were already shouldering the majority of family caregiving responsibilities in the face of the care system, and it has not helped to make the situation any better. Additionally, the disruption of daycare centers, schools, and after-school programs have been hard on fathers, but evidence shows working mothers have taken on more of the resulting childcare responsibilities and more frequently reducing their hours or leaving jobs entirely. Today, we have three dynamic speakers that will share some valuable information with us on our topic. We ask that you let our speakers present, and after all three, we will have a question and answer session. Now I turn the mic over to my colleague, Ms. Jeanette Esbrook.
Thank you, Alada. I'll just pick up on what you were saying about the statistics. According to the Census Bureau, the COVID pandemic resulted in women losing 12.2 million jobs. This reversed a decade of job growth for women. The job loss included 3.5 million mothers, as Alada mentioned, due to school-aged children and their need to care for them. They either lost their jobs, left their jobs, or took a leave of absence. While many have regained their jobs that they lost due to the pandemic, women are still down over 1.1 net jobs since February 2020. I'm pleased to announce our speaker from the National Women's Law Center, Ms. Julie Vogtman. She is the Director of Job Quality and Senior Counsel for the National Women's Law Center. At the National Women's Law Center, she engages in research, policy analysis, and advocacy, and public education to advance federal and state policies that benefit both women in low-paid jobs and their families, including higher wages, fair working schedule practices, and child care assistance. She has written extensively about women and the economy and the factors contributing to racial and gender pay disparities, including as a co-author of National Women's Law Center March 2022 report. Ms. Vogtman will provide an overview of three years of COVID, including the survey, which I referenced, that she made about a year ago at the 2-year mark. The topics of impact on women and employment include caregiving, finances, economic impact, policy solutions, and family leave. Julie Vogtman was quoted in a Washington Post February 12, 2023 article on women's returning to work. Quote, Julie is quoted as saying, "We are certainly seeing some very positive signs in the economy, but there are still disparities, both in and who is back to work and who is getting the best jobs," referring to challenges such as paid sick leave and more affordable childcare, all of which affect women of color and those with lower levels of income and education more. Prior to joining the National Women's Law Center in 2010, Julie was an associate with Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C. She is a magna cum laude graduate of Georgetown University Law Center, where she served as an editor for the Georgetown Journal on Poverty Law and Policy, and holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from Furman University. I'm pleased to turn this over to Julie Vogtman.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I do have some numbers to share today, and I feel like some visuals tend to help with that. So I have a few slides, and thanks so much again. And I'd like to start actually by adding just a little bit more context to that great intro that Alada and Jeanette provided by taking us back just very briefly to February of 2020. And so February of 2020, just a little bit pre-COVID, my colleagues on the research team at the Law Center and I were getting ready to release a report focusing on women in low-paying jobs, looking at the most recent data at the time, which was mostly from 2018. And we found that women were 64% of the workforce in the 40 lowest paying jobs in the country. So those are jobs like childcare workers, home health care workers, restaurant servers, grocery store cashiers, retail clerks, jobs that have been historically undervalued precisely because it is women and people of color who largely do them. We found that Black women, Latinas, and Native American women were particularly overrepresented in these jobs. And given that most of these jobs at the time paid typically less than about $12 or $13 an hour, we found that more than half of mothers who worked in these jobs, even working full-time, had incomes below twice the poverty line, including about 1 in 5 who were forced to raise their families in poverty. And you can see in the chart on this slide, I know there's a lot of bars there, but it shows that there are real differences by race. Among Black moms working full-time in low-paid jobs, for example, 67% had incomes below twice the poverty line. Now, I'm going to turn to our more recent research in a moment, but I do just think it's important, as Alada mentioned up front, to remind ourselves that things were very much not okay for millions of women and their families before the pandemic ever hit our shores. We entered this pandemic in a position where our economy in 2018 was ostensibly booming, but we still had millions of people, especially women of color and their families, barely making ends meet. And we were, of course, also already very far behind much of the world in terms of access to the most basic policies to support workers with caregiving responsibilities. And again, when we talk about workers with caregiving responsibilities, we're mostly talking about women. You're probably all aware that the United States is one of only a handful of countries without paid family leave, without paid medical leave. We invest far less in supporting childcare than most other countries, and instead expect families to shoulder this cost themselves. So that was February 2020. And we all know what happened to the childcare workers and the home health care workers and the restaurant servers and the retail clerks and the grocery store cashiers over the next couple of months. They either lost their jobs altogether, or they became recognized as essential workers and stayed on the job, but continued to have low pay, unpredictable and inflexible work hours, and few or even no benefits, even as they put their lives on the line to help all of us through a global pandemic. And our already very tenuous care infrastructure nearly collapsed. Now, as the pandemic surged, we at the Law Center kept tracking what was happening with women in the labor market. And you can see this big spike in unemployment rates here in March of 2020. And this is particularly comparing Black women and Latinas to white men, who remain far lower in terms of the unemployment throughout the first 2 years of the pandemic. So we saw how Black women and Latinas and women with disabilities were especially likely to lose their jobs, how women with caregiving responsibilities were dropping out of the labor force by the millions as the pressures of juggling caregiving and work became impossible to manage. I could obviously spend a lot more time reviewing the first year of the pandemic, but we don't have a lot of time. So I will fast forward to 2021, when we really saw, in sort of the tail end of the chart here, we saw unemployment numbers and labor force participation numbers for many groups begin to get closer to where they were before the pandemic. And I want to note that that is no small accomplishment. And I do give a lot of credit to the Biden administration and to Congress for acting quickly and investing dollars that were desperately needed to help families and our economy through the initial crisis. But around the 2-year mark of the pandemic, 1 year ago, with the stimulus checks and the expanded child tax credit payments and the emergency federal paid sick days and paid caregiving leave already gone or on their way out, we wanted to know more about how women were really faring than, sort of single statistics like the unemployment rate or the labor force participation rate could tell us. So we decided to ask them. And in February 2022, so just about exactly 2 years ago, we surveyed thousands of women across the country, as well as men, and found that so many women, even 2 years into the pandemic, had lost jobs or savings, or even just a sense of security that they had not yet recovered. So many women had not gotten back even to a February 2020 baseline, which of course is not actually a status quo that we want to return to. So for example, as of last February, this is from our big poll, more than 1 in 3 women and much higher shares of women who either lost or quit a job during the pandemic or were in a low paid job, which for this survey we defined as paying $15 an hour or less, said their family's financial situation was worse than before the pandemic. So women who lost or quit a job, for example, 60% said their financial situation a year ago was worse than it had been in February of 2020. Close to 6 in 10 women said their mental health was worse. And our polling confirms that at the 2-year mark, among people who had lost or quit a job during the pandemic, only 46% of women had gotten a new job compared to 67% of men. So a really big gap there. And we saw an even bigger gap for mothers versus fathers, and found that childcare, not too surprisingly, childcare or lack thereof, and the ongoing disruptions to that care was playing a big role in this gap. For example, nearly 1 in 4 mothers with children under 5 reported that they had to stop working when their children were not in school or childcare, compared to only about 1 in 10 fathers with young kids. And among women who were employed when we fielded our survey a year ago, 40% reported that they were paid $15 an hour or less in their job, and compared to just 16% of employed men. And more than half of women in these low-paid jobs said that they don't get any key benefits: no health insurance, no paid sick days, no paid family or medical leave, not even any paid vacation from their jobs. And I'll just note briefly too that I haven't really focused on remote work because for the women I work with and on behalf of at the Law Center, remote work generally has not been a big part of their lives, even throughout the past 3 years. Even during the height of the pandemic, most low-paid workers had to report to work in person. And you can see here that 1 year ago, among the low paid workers on the far right. Fully 2/3 worked only in person, with another 17% working in a hybrid arrangement. I could talk about my own experience working remotely and trying to parent and work during a pandemic, but I think that's a bit of a separate conversation and one that some of our other panelists are going to address today. So I know we're not just interested in what was happening a year ago, though, so I want to jump ahead again to where we are now. Now, I always prefer to hear the bad news first, so that's where I'm going to start. Today, oops, sorry for the typo. There's not 217 fewer women in the labor force today compared to February 2020. It is 217,000 fewer women in the labor force today compared to 3 years ago. And in contrast, there are 1.3 million more men in the labor force, and women's labor force participation is still down by about 1 percentage point relative to where it was before the pandemic, even when in the years prior to the pandemic, it had been on an upward trajectory. One reason for that might be the fact that we still have fewer, like a smaller childcare workforce, fewer childcare workers working today than we had 3 years ago. This sector has taken longer to recover than many others, in large part because it again is a sort of prototypical women-dominated job in the sense that it is almost all women who are childcare workers, disproportionately women of color, and it pays very, very low wages. Many of the jobs that have been driving the jobs recovery for women, in addition, are in leisure and hospitality. And those jobs also, the wages have risen a bit, which is good, but in many cases, they haven't kept up even with inflation. And these jobs still come with unstable and inadequate hours and few or no benefits. And then, of course, on top of all of that, we no longer have a federal right to abortion. And we know that the inability to obtain an abortion undermines career aspirations and economic security. People who are denied an abortion are nearly 4 times more likely to live below the poverty line. And we still have no paid family and medical leave at the federal level, no paid sick days, no universal child care assistance, no minimum wage increase. And so we can't really expect to see big changes in our jobs and in our lives as a result of the pandemic if our policies haven't actually changed as a result of the pandemic. But there is some good news too. And I know I'm running out of time, but this is my last slide. So for one, we saw in last year's midterm elections that women actually are not going to just sit back and watch our fundamental rights being taken away. So we saw a number of ballot measures, in particular, protecting women's right to an abortion. And voters also passed some really great economic initiatives, including a $15 minimum wage in Nebraska, increases in in wages for tipped workers here in DC, a new fund for universal pre-K in New Mexico, and new family and medical, paid family and medical leave policies are beginning to take effect in Colorado and Oregon this year. So there is progress. And of course, we're also seeing increased interest in unionization, which is one of the very best mechanisms for women to get higher and more equal pay and better work schedules. And we are seeing low unemployment, which again is not the only measure we look at, but it is an important one. And the Biden administration is making a real effort across the Department of Labor and other agencies to make sure, for example, that federal infrastructure dollars are going to build good jobs that women and people of color can access. And in a rather surprising development, the last thing I'll mention is that we actually did see some wins even at the federal level. at the very end of last year, Congress passed increased funds for childcare assistance, passed the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act to ensure that pregnant people don't have to choose between a healthy pregnancy and a paycheck, as well as the Pump Act, strengthening protections for nursing mothers. So we still have lots of work to do, but we are seeing some positive signs, and I will stop there so that there's plenty of time for the remaining presenters. But I look forward to taking questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I like the good news at the end, and it's nice to see that there are some gains in areas that are so important to working mothers, childcare, family leave, and we look forward to hearing more from you and the National Women's Law Center as benefits continue to grow for women. Alana, I'll turn this back to you.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Julie. That was great information. Appreciate it. Our next speaker is a mother and a professional. We all know the pandemic forced us into massive experiments with flexible work, but I think she told me she had already been working remotely when the whole experiment, the vast experiment started. Our next speaker is Miss Allison Wolff. She will discuss the impact of balancing work as a professional remotely with family and child care responsibilities. She is the web manager for NASA Space Explorations and Space Operations Mission Directorates. She has responsibility for managing application development projects and operates as an advisor for enterprise level application governance and policy boards. Her background in bio is extensive, so I won't go through all of it, but I will say that she has said while NASA is her passion, her first love is her family. So she approaches every day striving to make the world a better place for her 3 daughters and hope to be an exemplary leader in promoting work-life balance with a personal emphasis on physical and emotional wellness. She will share her insights into NASA's current and planned policies on virtual work and its impact on women. Allison, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alana. Can you hear me okay and see me okay?
I can. You might want to speak a little bit louder. You have a soft voice. Okay.
Okay, will do. As Alana said, I'm Allison Wolff, and I live in Houston, Texas with my husband and 3 daughters. And today I am going to talk about how the pandemic not only impacted our family, but also how it impacted me as a woman and a professional. So at the beginning of COVID, my husband and I were both working for NASA, and our oldest daughter, Avery, was 15, so about to be a sophomore in high school. Our middle daughter, Cadence, was 5 and about to start kindergarten, and then our youngest was 2, so little Wren was 2. When the lockdowns began, I was already working in a remote capacity for Marshall Space Flight Center out of Huntsville, Alabama. So I was very used to remote work, not a new concept. But I had never worked from home with my entire family home all the time. That was definitely a new experience. We were really fortunate that NASA already had the remote work technology in place. And the agency afforded us a lot of flexibilities to manage things at home. We had plenty to worry about, but we were monumentally blessed with job security and childcare flexibility in a time when really so many others were not. It's also worth sharing that our larger community in Houston was really divided on how to approach the pandemic. You know, there was a lot of conflict locally regarding mask policies, homeschooling, and lockdowns in general. And it was a tense time, and it was a really challenging dynamic to navigate. My husband and I took a very conservative approach to COVID safety throughout the pandemic. And even though most of the schools reopened in the fall of 2020, which was still peak pandemic, we opted to keep our children home and not send them into school, which was a somewhat controversial decision in the area. But this meant our oldest, who was a sophomore in high school, spent her entire day online attending classes from home while watching a lot of her peers in school over a webcam. The little ones really took a lot of our focus. My husband and I put blocks on our calendars throughout the day so we could alternate support for Cadence's kindergarten class. They had specific touch points throughout the day where she had to be online, 5 years old, had to be online and receive instruction. And so we were managing that. And then with the 2-year-old, it was just doing the best we could to keep her busy and praying that she would go down for her nap on time so we could schedule those calls in the afternoon that we needed to take. And there were days where I would turn the lights off in my makeshift office and rock a little one to sleep while I was on a telecon, or have a sleeping bag behind me and be working in the dark so they could take their naps. So logistically, we had designated workspaces in the house. So my husband had a folding table in our bedroom where he worked. I had a desk in an interior storage closet, essentially a very large interior room, and worked in there. And then Cadence, we set up a desk in our bedroom and she had her school supplies. Honestly, our oldest, our high schooler, had the best arrangement because she had a desk in her room and she shut the door and had privacy all day. So I think she would argue that it wasn't an ideal situation, but she certainly had the most conducive remote work environment. In terms of what the work week was, the 40-hour work week didn't exist. You worked when you could. A lot of times it was after the kids had gone to sleep. You get the kids down to sleep, and then you really can do some of that focused work that you didn't get to that day. And I considered myself really somebody who had this enormous capacity for work. I can work quickly. I can handle a lot of challenges. And I was even tasked with leading the implementation of our agency's contact tracing and tracking application, which we had to develop and deliver quickly so that folks who still had to work on site had a way of tracking the spread of the virus. But it didn't matter how hard I tried, I could not find the capacity to do everything I needed to do while honestly meeting these incredibly high standards that I'd had for myself. I had all these people depending on me, and I had to be at the top of my game. And I approached it like any other challenge. I kept my head down. I worked hard. I knew that relief was imminent. But it never came. Like, weeks passed and then months passed, and there was really no end in sight. And there were days where I just would go into the bathroom and cry because I thought, I am failing at everything. And one of the most eye-opening aspects of this was teaching kindergarten to Cadence, because she would have to submit these videos demonstrating that she comprehended what had been taught that day. And I mean, a 5-year-old learning to write numbers, learning to write letters. And we would film these videos, and she didn't want any help or any prompts. And she wanted it to be perfect before she submitted it. And we would do take after take after take of these videos of her showing that she could do the work. And I mean, I went back and looked at some of these videos in preparation for this, and there are her face is red from crying. Like, she's just so frustrated, and she can't get through this. And I saw a program recently where they were talking about teaching boys versus girls how to code. And they were talking about how the boys, if they needed help, they would call the instructor over and they'd have all this code and they'd say, can you help me figure out what I did here? But when the girls would ask for help, the instructors would go over and there'd be a blank screen. And they would say, but they'd go back through the history and they'd realize that these little girls had constructed, deleted, just couldn't get it right and kept erasing it all. And what they took from this is that the boys were taught to be brave and the girls were taught to be perfect. And I'm processing all of this and I'm seeing my daughter go through this. And I'm just so frustrated with myself for not being able to do everything I need to do. And I'm realizing, am I inadvertently putting these expectations on her to be perfect? I mean, is that the example that I'm setting? Is that what I'm doing to myself? And it wasn't sustainable. I mean, it took its toll. And eventually I just realized I was completely burnt out. I'm generally a very positive person, but I was just cynical and resentful, and I felt myself disconnecting emotionally from my family and just got to the point where it's like something has to change. And so I stepped back and I sat down and I wrote my top 5 priorities in life. What are my top 5 priorities? And I love NASA. Like, I love walking into the door and just having a purpose right off the bat. That's what working for NASA feels like. But I got to tell you, it wasn't even in my top 3. And when it didn't hit my top 3, I thought, okay, I know where I need to start editing. So I requested to take a step back and I took a position with fewer responsibilities so that I could get well and focus on my family. And I do think that was the right decision. I think it aligned with my personal values, but it was so hard because first I felt this deep commitment to support my team at work. And I thought, I'm letting people down. I'm really failing them. But then there was also the self-perception and the self-esteem. Am I somebody who can't cut it? Is this who I am now? Somebody who just can't deal with it? And a turning point for me in this whole process was a few months later, I got a call from the young woman who had been my deputy. And she said, Allison, I can't believe how much work you were doing. She's like, I don't even have kids at home. And this is an intense amount of work that you were taking on. And then she shared, she said, I'm going through some pretty intense personal stuff myself right now. And thank you for letting me know that it's okay to say when. And that really was a turning point for me because I realized that by taking that step back, I became an exemplary leader, it's so hard to do sometimes. I took a risk when I prioritized wellness, but I ultimately became a demonstration of these values that I had been preaching to everybody and not practicing myself. And I've seen women in other situations make similar decisions recently. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, who led her country through the pandemic, resigned. And she said, I no longer have enough in the tank. And these are difficult but really important decisions that we have to make as women. And a lot of referenced it, but I really do want to make the world better for my 3 daughters. I hope that I can be an example to them as someone who believes in the value of hard work, but puts her personal values for family and wellness first. But I think these decisions, regardless of the decisions we make, they're often judged. We're judged for working, for not working, for having kids, for not having kids. There's this endless list of expectations placed upon us and then expectations we have to be perfect in every dynamic all the time. But I think ultimately it's important that we have compassion, not just for others, but for ourselves, and we give ourselves grace. And so I'd like to wrap it up, if I may, with a quote from Brené Brown. She said, self-awareness and self-love matter. Who we are is how we lead. And ultimately, this challenge became an opportunity to redefine what success means to me. And I'm still learning from this experience, but it ultimately led to a very important shift in my perspective as a woman and as a leader. So I really appreciate the time and the opportunity to share my story today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison. That's a great story. And just quickly, as we go to our next speaker, I'll just mention I can relate to what you're saying, because while I don't have any children, I have several nieces, and one in particular that comes to mind who was not fortunate like you. She had to leave her job to take care of her kids, and trying to teach them, feeling unprepared, trying to do the household chores. She was just very frustrated, and she still has not recovered. As a matter of fact, right before I came on, she was sending me a note asking me to send her some money because she needed some help. And that's just, that's just one. It's so many others in the African American community, Latino, Asian, women that are suffering, that have not been able to work from home or to take care of their families. So
Absolutely.
I appreciate you sharing that story with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lotta.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Jeanette, you want to bring up our next speaker?
Yes, and first I want to thank Allison Wolff for sharing her experience. It was good to hear an actual live event of an actual experience of what we are reading about, how difficult it is without the kind of childcare, even the minimum that we had before the pandemic. And it's a challenge that we continue to face. The data that we will be learning from Sarah Jane, who likes to be referred to as SJ, as our next speaker from the Women's Bureau, will help us understand the impact on the total effect of what we just heard from Allison, from Allison, and from you too, Alada. Our speaker is S.J. Glynn. She serves as a senior advisor for the Women's Bureau. She's a labor sociologist and policy analyst with experience working at the national, state, and local level. Prior to joining the Department of Labor, S.J. was a senior fellow with the Women's Initiative at the Center for American Progress, where she previously held the role of Director of Women's Economic Policy. S.J. has spent her career researching and working to advance policies that help support employment and economic security for women and caregivers, including paid family and medical leave, paid sick days, workplace flexibility, and pay equity. Before beginning her career in policy work, S.J. was an adjunct lecturer in sociology at Vanderbilt and Belmont universities. She co-authored a report issued by the Department of Labor on the impact of COVID-19 on women's employment, called Bearing the Cost. S.J. received her bachelor's degree in women's studies with a concentration in LGBTQ studies from UCLA and her doctorate degree in sociology from Vanderbilt University. I'll turn this over to S.J.
Whew, I apologize. This has been a real day for me in terms of technology, but I'm here. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Allison, so much for sharing your story. That was really very moving, and it's hard to follow up. And Julie, I apologize because of all the technical difficulties. I came in midway through, but I know your work and know your brilliance and appreciate all the setup and the data that you gave us up top. I'm going to try to kind of weave together a little bit of what we heard using some data that we have from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then hopefully, from there we can transition into conversation, because I'm eager to hear from the other panelists and other folks what they're thinking about all of this. But, I want to go back first and talk a little bit about the recovery and where we are right now. Julie set this up really well in her presentation. We're still missing a lot of folks from the labor force, right? We are not yet back at the same level of labor force participation or the same employment rates that we were at pre-pandemic. And so, right now, like Julie said, there's more than 200,000 women, adult women, who are missing from the workforce. And once we account for population growth, if we wanted to get back to the same employment rate that we were at pre-pandemic, that represents more than 1 million women that would still need to become employed in order to meet women's employment rate that we saw, back in January, February of 2020. So that's a lot of people. And there's a lot of questions about kind of what's going on, what's holding women back from being able to re-enter the workforce at the same rates that they were before. And, I do think it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of really positive signs that we have been seeing. And the pandemic was a really unique event in a lot of ways, not just because it was such a devastating global health event, right, public health event, but in terms of the economic impact, it created a recession that was really unprecedented in terms of what we've seen in the American economy. So, women are almost exactly half of all workers, even right now, even at the depressed levels that we're seeing. And that's not a new thing. Women have been at least 49% of employed people since 2008, right? So women are a significant sector of the workforce. But this was the first time that we had an economic recession where the bulk of the job losses went to women. And that was because of the particular ways that the pandemic played out. So like Julie said, there were two big things that happened, right? One was the caregiving responsibilities piece. Allison spoke really movingly and honestly about what that kind of looks like in folks' lives. And then the other piece is about the jobs that women were more likely to hold and the industries that were most devastated by the pandemic. So, women, and particularly women of color, lost the majority of jobs. And that was in part because women were more likely to get laid off or be fired than men, regardless of what type of job they were in. That was particularly true for Black and Latina women. But it's also because women are over-concentrated in the industries that really shut down. So things like leisure and hospitality jobs, right? There's an extreme over-concentration of women in those positions, and those are jobs that disappeared when people were staying home and where businesses were closing their doors as a result of the public health event that we were all living through. And there has been growth and improvement in those sectors as things have opened back up with vaccines and, declining rates of illness and all of these things. We have absolutely been seeing growth in these sectors. It's very promising, but we are still missing, a significant number of jobs in these sectors that employed a lot of women beforehand. So there's still nearly 300,000 missing jobs in leisure and hospitality. The government sector is still missing about 340,000 pre-pandemic state and local education jobs. The care sector, like Julie mentioned earlier too, is still down. So there's nearly 60,000 fewer child care workers than there were previously. There's also more than 250,000 nursing and residential care workers that are missing relative to pre-pandemic. So the care sector has really been devastated. And while, on the one hand, we have definitely clawed our way back from the extreme unemployment that we were experiencing in 2020. And, particularly for women of color, Black and Latina women, especially, whose unemployment rates were the highest, we've seen tremendous growth. There is continued positive movement, but Black adult women's unemployment rate is still roughly twice the rate for white women, right? And unfortunately, that has historically always been true. So even when the economy is incredibly strong, Black women's unemployment rate is usually roughly about twice the rate for white women, which is due to a lot of different factors, including, but not limited to, institutional racism, right? So, we've seen the depths of where we were in 2020. We have been climbing back out of that in really unprecedented ways that I don't want to undermine how significant and how rapid in historical terms the economic growth and the recovery of jobs has been. But we are not to where we need to be. And I think all of us are also aware that, getting back to where we were in January, February 2020 should not be our goal, right? We don't want to return back to the status quo. We should be trying to think about how we can arrive in a place that's better than where we started. So I want to talk a little bit about, telework and remote work and what we know about that and how that kind of fits in with some of these other trends that I just mentioned. So if we look at the data prior to the pandemic, prior to 2020, remote and telework were relatively rare. And that's for a couple of different reasons. So part of that is just about job characteristics, right? The type of job that a person holds can determine whether or not they can telework. My brother-in-law is a plumber. He does not have a job that allows for telework or remote work, right? But my sister-in-law is a teacher, and so during the pandemic, she was absolutely able, with a lot of difficulty, but she was able to, maintain her job and continue teaching, albeit remotely, right? So the characteristics of the job are a big piece of what can determine the ability to telework. But that's not the only piece of what's going on there. So, we knew that more than a third of jobs based on the characteristics of them could technically be done remotely, but far fewer than a third of jobs actually allowed folks to telework. And so in 2019, if we look back to before the pandemic, about 22% of people who were employed worked from home, and women were more likely than men to work from home pre-pandemic. About 26% of employed women relative to 20% of employed men. And there's a lot of different reasons why you would see that discrepancy. Part of it is also that the more formal education someone has, the more likely they were pre-pandemic to be able to work from home. And women have higher levels of educational attainment than men do, right? And working from home is also pretty tightly associated, or was pre-pandemic, with earnings. So the higher someone's earnings were, the more likely it was that they were going to have the ability to work from home, looking at this data from 2019. I think another piece that's interesting to think about this in the context of what our lives have been like over the last few years is not just, are you able to do your work remotely? Are you able to continue to log in and, get your tasks done and get paid from home? But also, what are the hours that you're expected to do that during, right? So this was something I saw a lot with my friends who had kids who were in school. They would work for a few hours in the morning if they have disability, work for a few hours in the morning, help their kids with school sort of during the middle of the day, and then log back into work in the evening to complete the tasks that they needed to do that day. So that adds up to an incredibly long day of doing work, right? But having the ability to kind of split your time up, having the ability to have that flexibility was really important for folks to be able to manage caregiving responsibilities alongside their work responsibilities, right? So a lot of folks pre-pandemic, nearly 60%, said that they had a flexible schedule ability, but most of that was not formalized, right? Only about 30% had a formal agreement with their employer to permit flexibility. So part of what's going on there in that really high percentage is that what people will say is a flexible schedule is actually a volatile schedule, right? Because the days that they're working are moving around, or the hours that they're working are moving around. And maybe they have a little bit of autonomy and a little bit of control over that. They can swap shifts, or they can, pick which shifts they want to work. This is particularly true like in retail and in some restaurant jobs, right? You can swap shifts, or you can, sign up to work particular shifts. But really having that true autonomy and that true control over when you do your work is relatively rare. And it's a minority of workers that have the ability to have that kind of scheduling control. And so again, we saw pre-pandemic a lot of the same patterns that we saw with the ability to work remotely, right? People who worked full time, people who had more formal education, people who were higher earners, they were all more likely to have that level of control over their schedule and over their work hours relative to folks who worked part-time, who had less education, less formal education, and who were working in jobs that paid lower wages. And again, obviously though, like the type of job that you have is going to determine some of this, right? So the sectors where folks are the least likely to have that control over their schedule are things like education and health services, right? If you're a teacher, you don't get to choose when the school day starts and stops, right? You're kind of bound by that. Construction workers also have pretty little control over the hours that they're working because that is determined by the job site and a lot of other factors, right? So it's not just a question about like, should people have this benefit or not? We also need to be thinking about it within the context of the types of employment that people have and the types of jobs that people have. So then 2020 happened and we saw huge jumps in terms of folks who had the ability to work remotely and had the ability to kind of shift their work hours around a little bit. It created an opening for a lot of experimentation. So, you know, the percentage of workers that were able to work from home roughly doubled. And depending on which data source you're looking at, you can get slightly different numbers. Different surveys have different statistics that they assign to this, right? But the overall trend is somewhere between, you know, 35 to 45% of workers were able to work from home. Some of the higher rates are also likely because people who weren't able to work from home were more likely to lose their jobs and to become unemployed. So then they're no longer in the population of workers that we're, you know, applying that that metric to. But one of the other things that I thought was really interesting is that regardless of which data source you're looking at, you know, women were more likely than men to be working from home and to be working remotely. But like we know, that also meant they were much more likely to be managing family care responsibilities on top of maintaining paid employment during the day. So, you know, if we go to May 2020, which is when some of this data first started getting collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau, that particular survey shows us that about 35% of all workers in May of 2020 were working remotely because of the pandemic, right? So that's not including folks who might have been working remotely prior. I worked remote in the role I was in prior to the start of the pandemic, right? So the configuration of my work didn't change dramatically. But we know that, you know, prime age workers, those that are between 25 to 54, were the most likely, nearly 40% were working remotely because of the pandemic. Women were more likely than men, 40%, nearly 41% of women versus 31% of men. So pretty significant difference there. You know, there were significant differences by race and ethnicity. More than half of Asian workers reported being able to work remotely, compared to less than a quarter of Latino workers. You know, folks who were married were more likely to be able to work remotely. Parents were more likely to say that they were working remotely, and people with higher levels of education were much more likely to say that they were working remotely, right? If folks who had an advanced degree, it was about 70%, versus, you know, 15% for those who were high school graduates only, right? So a lot of variation and a lot of inequality in terms of access to telework. So we've done some surveys of employers to see, okay, you increased ability to telework during the pandemic. As things started to improve, as conditions started to improve, you know, are you going to maintain that? And there's been some really interesting results. You know, nationally, about 60% of the establishments that increased telework during the pandemic said they planned to maintain that. And so that represents, you know, millions of workers, more than half of workers in some sectors, right? Their employers were saying, we're going to continue this telework, this increased telework ability. But if we look at data that's more recent, so that survey was done, you know, in 2021, The most recent data, and they're no longer collecting this, but the most recent data we have on the actual usage of telework among the employed population is from September of 2022, so last September. And there was a significant drop, right? So in May 2020, it was 35% of all workers were teleworking because of the pandemic. By September, it was 5% of 2022, it was 5%. So some of that might be because folks are continuing to telework, but they're not reporting that it's because of the pandemic. If it was a permanent shift, for example, in the structure of their job, so maybe it might be that there are more than just 5% of workers who are actually maintaining this benefit, right? But that is a very significant decline. And that decline happened across all groups, right? Again, it was uneven, but now it's much closer in terms of men and women who are teleworking because of the pandemic. A lot of the racial disparities narrowed. Hispanic and Latino workers are still by far the least likely to have that ability. But the gap between white and Black workers having that telework because of the pandemic, that gap has shrunk. They're almost equal in terms of percentage. And the pattern by education is still very, very strong though, right? So folks who have at least a bachelor's degree or more are, 2 to 3 to 4 times as likely to be able to telework relative to workers who have less formal education. So to me, this data is interesting because this matters, right? This is people's real lives. For me, the ability to telework has been incredibly important in terms of being able to maintain employment in the midst of everything else that was happening in my life, even prior to the pandemic, right? This can be a really important work support for people, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that not every job is going to allow for this type of work to be done. And a lot of these discrepancies that we see and a lot of the unevenness that we see, right, by education, by race and ethnicity, across gender, has so much to do with occupational segregation and the types of jobs that folks get sorted into. So that happens along gendered lines, and that's how we tend to talk about it a lot. Certainly at the Women's Bureau, we talk a lot about occupational segregation in relation to gender and the fact that women are so much more likely to work in particular sectors and particular types of jobs relative to men. But there's also a lot of occupational segregation that happens along race and ethnicity as well, right? Folks get sorted into particular types of jobs based on stereotypes, based on expectations, and based on opportunities that are or are not made available to them because of their gender, because of their race or ethnicity, because of their sexual orientation, because of all of the different reasons, right, that people get sort of stereotyped and tracked into particular educational lanes and into particular types of jobs. So I think to me, this stands out as one of the really important pieces that we need to think critically about and that we need to figure out how to shift if we want to have greater equity in the labor market and in our economy, is how can we start to really, truly disrupt this occupational segregation that is such an enduring and problematic issue. And I think that there's sort of two tactics that are important to keep in mind as we're thinking about how to address this problem. One is how can we make more opportunities available to women with a particular focus on women of color, since they're the ones who tend to be the most disadvantaged in terms of access to high quality, high paying jobs that offer the ability to do things like telework when you need to. But we also have to be aware that, every job that exists in this economy exists for a reason, right? We have decided collectively that it's important, and some of them may feel more or less important than others. I've got to say, it's hard for me to understand why certain social media kind of jobs are that important. I don't know that being an Instagram influencer is the most important thing one could do in terms of, social well-being and the continuation of life, relative to something like, a child care worker, which I think is an extraordinarily important social good and something that is very important for the overall functioning of our economy and the ability for us as a society to thrive. But we've decided that every job that exists for a reason, right? So we can't just say everybody should become a construction worker, or everybody should become an engineer, or everybody should become whatever the job is at the moment that we're talking about, because the reality is we need every job that exists right now. And so we absolutely should be focused on creating opportunities for women and for people of color and for everybody who has been shut out to enter into high quality jobs that are being created right now. That is a huge focus of this administration. It is a huge focus of the Department of Labor and certainly of the Women's Bureau. And I care very deeply about that work. It matters, and we need to be doing that. But we also, at the same time, need to be looking at where people are and meeting them where they are right now. And that also means that we've got to be thinking about how we can raise the floor on what are often very low quality jobs that women and people of color are disproportionately likely to hold right now, because our society will not be able to function and our economy will not be able to function and grow and thrive if we are continuing to just make certain jobs be the good jobs and allowing the folks who are doing the work that is, and the labor that is truly the backbone of our economy, to continue to be, devalued and underpaid and, not receive the resources and the respect that they need. So, I'm going to stop there because I really want to make sure that we have time for conversation. But I so appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all today. And again, apologize for all the technical difficulties in joining. So thank you.
So I think we want to open it up for questions. If you have a question, I encourage you to unmute yourself and tell who you are and ask your question. If there is someone in particular you'd like to direct it to in terms of Julie, Allison, or SJ, please do. Any questions?
Hello, this is Karen Humphrey from California, at one time sex equity coordinator under the Perkins program. And I would like to direct this question to Harriet Stonehill. The Perkins programs that were targeted to bringing non-traditional students into a broader range of occupations, including women and other specifics were the program itself was wiped out, although the money wasn't, in '98. And there has been very little apparent effort in the education sector. There's been a disregard for trade and crafts, for career technical education in general. But it seems to me that it remains as segregated as it was. So if you don't give kids an opportunity in middle and high school to start educating themselves for jobs that may not be traditional for their sex, then you need to have something. So my question is, it's not just a case of structuring jobs and valuing jobs and helping get people in. I just think it's, what do we do about the education piece before you ever get to a job? How do we keep people from setting up expectations that there was nothing they'd ever be except a job that a person of their description fit in? And I don't know whether it said she wasn't sure Harriet would be able to answer. Is Harriet able to answer?
Was that meant for the labor, the Women's Bureau?
Yeah, DOL. Yeah, Harriet was that Harriet Stonehill?
No, that's not Harriet. That's SJ.
Well, it was a person. It was the person who spoke last.
Yes, that's SJ.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
No, that's all right.
Well, then it's for SJ.
Yes.
Yeah, is it okay? Can I jump in? I apologize.
Yes.
I'm just on audio, so I can't see. It's hard to know cues. No, you've raised such an important point, and I'm really glad that you did, right? Because we can't just wait until folks are, 20 years old and trying to figure out how to pay their bills to be thinking about these issues of occupational segregation. And the tracking that happens, certainly along gender, there's a lot more research on the gender angle, but absolutely in terms of race and ethnicity as well, that tracking starts really early. And the expectations about, what is available to you and what sort of life that you should have and all of these things, those happen literally from the time that babies are born, right? Like we treat baby boys very differently than we treat infant girls. I mean, there's an entire enormous literature of social science research showing this. So the ways that we are socializing kids and the ways that the education system plays into that are incredibly important. You know, I am in full agreement that there has to be interventions within that space as well to help folks really be exploring where their interests are, where their skills are, and to be developing those skills and affinities from a very young age to open up a greater range of possibilities for them once they enter into the labor market. But I will admit, because I work at DOL and I'm not in education policy, I know less about it. I know there are interventions in those space. I know that there are a lot of folks who are thinking about that, but I'm less familiar with the policies that are currently being implemented or explored in that arena. But I'm in full agreement with you that it's a really important component of what we're talking about, for sure.
Thank you. And it suggests to me some interagency work from the DOL and the Department of Education. And it's not just K-12, it's also directing women in college to, and men for that matter, to certain occupations. So I appreciate that. I would think that a task force, because we've eliminated so many of the governmental supports for eliminating gender discrimination and racial discrimination, an interagency task force between DOL and Department of Education might be one strategy for beginning to identify and increase the support for programs that could help. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice? Ms. McIntosh, are you saying something?
Yes. I would like to mention the power of an individual story, and such as Allison gave us. And when I went to college and graduate school, testimony about one's own life experience was not on the table as anything related to life, literature, or history. It was, in my cultural group, seen as self-indulgent to try to figure out one's own story. But today I found Allison's account of being herself in the midst of the pandemic and the pressures it put on the whole family, as well as the whole society. I found it extremely powerful. And it relates in a way to my own work about white privilege. It consists of a long list of examples of the way in which I experience white skin privilege. And it's quite outside of what I was taught about social science and history and humanities and biological science. It's an outlier. But this testimony had a very big power, especially for people of color, hearing one white person talk about aspects of their life. You know, I said things like, I can, my examples included things like, I can go shopping alone without fearing I might be followed or harassed or suspected of shoplifting. Or if I ask to talk to the person in charge, I'm very likely to be facing a person of my race. Or if a cop pulls me over, I can be sure that hasn't happened because of the color of my skin. These testimonies are like cousins of what Allison did today in telling the story. And we picked up on the fact that when it became, well, she gave some theoretical gender perspective when she said the boys were raised to be brave and the girls to be perfect. I think that's very true and very useful. When she could no longer be perfect to her standards or the expectations surrounding her, then she had the honesty to say, I can't do this, or I won't do this. And I just think that is very strong. And I hope everybody benefited from it the way I did.
Thank you. And yes, we agree it was a very powerful story. That's why we wanted to share it with everyone. And thank you again, Allison. Any other questions or comments?
I want to say this, it needn't be a contrast between her testimony and the very sound social science we were hearing from the other two presenters. I don't want to say that hers was better. I work at a Center for Research on Women, and I'm surrounded by very good social science research that we need as a culture to find out what's happening. But your originality here was to add the personal testimony about one woman's experience. So it's a plus, but the other presentations from my point of view were excellent also.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I want to thank Peggy for her comments and especially your addendum. I agree that the combination of all three of our speakers today really lend a lot of information to all of us, a fullness of the experience as women in the workforce. So I'm interested in seeing if we can have them back in the future as we have lived through and continue to live through the challenges that face us.
Okay. So I'll just close by saying, well, we realize that the place for women is in the family and in the workforce. So we need to make sure that we're doing everything that we can in terms of interventions to support them in all the roles that they choose to support or be in. And that means things like fair compensation, improving access to jobs, family-friendly policies, and supporting them in whatever chosen roles as breadwinners, mothers, or the combination, or whatever. But before I turn it over to our chairs, we would like to thank again, my colleagues and I, we would like to thank Miss Julie and Miss Allison and Miss SJ for your excellent presentations today. And we would like to thank all of you that attended for your participation. So now I turn it over to our chairs.
Hi, this is Sue Klein. Sorry I missed the first two presentations, but I was attending the Senate hearing on ERA. They had a resolution to eliminate the threat of the timeline so that although ERA has passed in 38 states, it can be implemented right away, which is the desire of many of the women's groups. The hearing room was packed, and instead of lasting 1 hour as anticipated from 10 to 11, it lasted from 10 to about 12:15. So sorry I'm late for this meeting. And I'd like to also invite you all to our next CWI meeting, which is on March 21st. And we're going to get an update on two important women's history museums, American Women's History Museums, the National American National Women's History Museum, which has been virtual, is going to be opening an in-person exhibit at the Martin Luther King Library in Washington, D.C. on Washington, D.C. feminist history. We'll hear about that as well as their other plans on March 21st. And we are also going to hear from Julissa Marenko, who's an assistant secretary at the Smithsonian, who's going to update us on the plans for the Smithsonian's American Women's History Museum. And we've heard from the press that they've selected two possible sites for this museum, and I'm sure she'll have a lot more information to share with us. So please join us on March 21st for the noon Zoom CWI meeting. And I'm looking forward to listening as soon as possible to the video audio tape of this meeting and learning a lot from what you all learned. And I want to thank Alada and Jeanette and Sherry so much for organizing this meeting and the wonderful presenters. Alada, back to you.
I'm out. I'm leaving it to Connie.
I knew that was coming.
Of course.
I want to thank you. This has been one of the most informative meetings. And Peggy, it's lovely to see you again. Peggy is responsible for woking me, as we say in the vernacular, when I was at the American Federation of Teachers about issues. So I want to tell all of our speakers, they were absolutely wonderful, that we are going to have a recording of this that will be on YouTube, that you'll be able to send people to and will be free to view. And I'm excited about the next meeting that's coming. I'm always excited about all the meetings we do because there's such good learning experiences. You should hunt around our website and look for our past recorded meetings and see what you think. And that's all I got, folks. That's all.
Okay, Sherry or Jeanette, anything else?
Thank you for your inspired suggestion and programming, Alada.
Thank you for being a great colleague.
Really, that's true.
Yeah, it was great working as a team, and I think the results of today's meeting has been really good, and I look forward to seeing it on YouTube again, sharing it with my husband.
There you go.
Well, thank you all.
We look forward to seeing you at our next meeting.
Yes.
Peggy, great seeing you from Sue.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.